Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage the Research Visiting Speaker Series. Thanks for coming. I know it's kind of late in the day. We typically do them a little bit earlier, but thanks for joining us today. Today, we welcome Alan Deutschman to Microsoft Research to discuss something that we already discuss here a lot, and that is change, how to make it happen, and why it rarely does. Why do people continue their unhealthy lifestyles even when faced with death? Why do the majority of criminals go back to prison? And why do companies continue on failing paths when they have the information, the resolve, and even the fear to do otherwise? What is it about change that we don't understand? Can real change happen, and if so, how? The answer, thank goodness, is yes, change can happen, but only if you let go of the myths that you believe about change and follow a few revolutionary steps, as some of the individuals, groups, and companies have, as profiled in Alan's book, the rather starkly titled Change or Die. Alan Deutschman is a senior writer and West Coast bureau chief at Fast Company and is the author of two previous books, The Second Coming of Steve Jobs and A Tale of Two Valleys, Wine, Wealth, and the Battle for the Good Life in Napa and Sonoma. So please welcome Alan Deutschman.
Thank you, Kim. Everyone, you have to forgive me for my attire. I rarely wear a suit. Only when I'm surrounded by people who have more graduate degrees than I do, it gives kind of an extra sense of protection and self-confidence. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the inspiration for this book and why I wrote it and the origins of its ideas. I've been a business journalist for almost 20 years now. I started my career at Fortune magazine in New York in 1988. The first article I wrote was about venture capitalists. In '92, they sent me to San Francisco to be their West Coast correspondent, and I wrote a story about Microsoft back then, and have been following. I did actually a cover story on Microsoft and Bill Gates in 1992, and have been following business and technology as a journalist ever since then. In the last couple of years, I've been at Fast Company magazine. For Fast Company, I was trying to do an article about IBM, and I went to a conference that IBM held about the future of healthcare. And they put together a very distinguished panel of experts, and I thought that these leaders of the healthcare system were going to say that digital technology was the solution to all of the problems in healthcare, because after all, it was being hosted by an information technology company, and after 2 decades on this beat, I do agree that digital technology is the solution for everything. And so I thought they were going to be talking about the computational power used to decode the human genome, genetic engineering, the benefits that we're going to get from digitizing the records of patients into databases that can be searched and analyzed for better diagnosis of illness and treatment, that kind of technological solution. And so I was incredibly surprised when Ray Levy, who is the head of the Global Medical Forum, which is kind of a worldwide summit meeting of leaders from throughout the healthcare system, and he had been a pioneering surgeon. He said that the problems in the healthcare system today are the same as they were when he was at Harvard Medical School as a student in 1955. And back then, there were a number of studies that showed that 80% of all healthcare spending wasn't because of the people wasn't dealing with illnesses caused by people's genetic inheritance, wasn't being caused by problems because of environmental factors. It all came from these 5 behavioral factors, by and large behavioral factors, about how people choose to live their lives. And those, I mean, you don't need an MD degree to guess what they are. It's because people smoke. It's because they drink too much. It's because they eat too much. It's because they don't exercise enough, and because they have too much stress. And those 5 factors overwhelmingly accounted for healthcare spending. And the same thing is true today, except today we spend over $2 trillion a year on healthcare in America, and it's almost 1/5 of our entire economy, and yet for the trillions and trillions that we're spending, we've made discouragingly little progress against the major illnesses, against heart disease, cancer, although the news in the paper yesterday was somewhat encouraging, stroke, and we have a healthcare system which many people think is in crisis and is incredibly frustrating and difficult to deal with. So the big issue is human behavior and how to change human behavior. And Ray Levy, again, 50 years into his medical career, says we just don't know how to get people to change. And this kind of astonished me. But what really blew me away and what set me on this 2-year odyssey of writing this book was the next speaker, Ed Miller, who's the dean of the medical school and the CEO of the hospital at Johns Hopkins University, fairly distinguished institution. And he said, the really interesting case study is when you look at patients with severe heart disease. These are people who have just unbearable pain. The chest pain is awful. It hurts if they try to cross the street before the traffic light changes. It hurts too much if they try to climb the stairs. It's too painful if they try to make love to their spouse or to someone else's spouse. This is a profound health crisis, life-threatening. And so you look at these patients, and to literally save their lives, they go through dramatic surgery, coronary bypass surgery, angioplasty. Maybe they have a vein taken from their arm or leg and planted as a bypass to allow blood to flow through to their heart. Maybe they have a stent to prop open an artery to allow blood to flow through. And the doctors perform this life-saving surgery. And then they say this is only a temporary fix. As miraculous as these surgical techniques are, they really don't last very long. For angioplasty, very often it has to be repeated within 4 to 6 months. And that is exactly what happened a few years ago to Vice President Dick Cheney. With coronary bypass surgery, it's really a matter of several years, and then often it has to be repeated again, or it just can't be repeated, and it's fatal. The doctors go to their patients and say, you are literally in a change or die situation. You now really have to start living your life in a healthy way, and it means, cut the smoking, the drinking, the overeating, find a way to deal with stress in your life, exercise, or you're going to die. And the dean of Johns Hopkins Medical School said that study after study have shown that 2 years later, 90% of these heart patients have failed to change their behavior, have failed to switch to healthier lifestyles. And so we just don't know how to change people's behavior. So I left this conference and went back home to San Francisco and was just kind of befuddled and was in really a personal crisis for several days because I write for a monthly magazine that's all about change and innovation. And I'd spent the last 2 decades, coming up here to interview people at Microsoft and at Amazon and, interviewing Sergey Brin at Google and people like Richard Branson at Virgin and these people who, are the icons of embracing and mastering change and innovation and thriving on changing your industry and trying to change the world. I wrote a book about Steve Jobs, who's very closely associated with this kind of rhetoric. And, if people really can't change, or if only this tiny percentage of people thrive on change, is publishing a magazine about change and innovation for 700,000 subscribers kind of a hoax that pays my mortgage but isn't really the most honest and respectable thing to do? And I hadn't studied psychology at all. I hadn't even taken Psychology 101 in my undergraduate years at Princeton. I hadn't even taken the really popular psychology course on campus, Abnormal Psychology, which was better known as Nuts and Sluts. I had studied other subjects, and I had spent a lot of time as a journalist. And so when presented with this kind of crucial extreme test of heart patients and who couldn't change in the change or die situation, I didn't have the psychological background, but as a journalist I had kind of great resources for getting information and researching different real life situations. And I thought that, well, let's use the scientific method. If we can find cases that go against the 9 out of 10 heart patients study, then maybe it won't be so compelling. And in the San Francisco area, right around me, I saw 3 cases of profound change that showed that people could change in situations that we all consider to be absolutely impossible. The first one was literally down the street from me. I was living right by the University of California at San Francisco Medical School and had lots of friends who were doctors there. And so I knew about the work of Dr. Dean Ornish, who advocates an extreme vegan diet for heart patients that derives less than 5% of its calories from fat. And I didn't know that much about him, but I knew that he had this kind of radical alternative plan. And I went and I looked at the scientific literature. And Dr. Ornish and his colleagues throughout his career has published rigorous scientific studies in all of the leading peer-reviewed, most prestigious scientific and medical journals that have shown that he can take these patients with severe heart disease whose insurance companies would pay for them to have coronary bypass surgery or angioplasty. And instead of having the surgeries, he puts them through a program where he takes a group of heart patients and he gives them a whole team of people to teach them and to work with them to adopt a new lifestyle. He gives them a vegetarian chef to teach them how to cook food in a different way. He gives them a personal fitness trainer to teach them how to exercise. He puts them in psychological support groups. He encourages them to find community, spirituality. He has kind of a whole crew of people who work together with this group of patients over a period of months. It costs about $7,000 per patient, which is a fraction of what it costs for heart surgery, which is easily $40,000, $50,000, often over $100,000 if there are complications. And in the studies, he's shown that 77% of the heart patients who enter this experimental study wind up switching to the dramatically healthy lifestyle. They take a vegetarian or a vegan diet. They go from being sedentary to exercising. And not only do they stick with it for the 6 months or 1 year of the program, they stick with it for the long term and are able to stop and usually reverse the course of their heart disease without having to have surgery. So if the conventional medical system, 9 out of 10 patients don't change, aren't motivated to change, how can, in the Dr. Ornish program, almost 8 out of 10 patients make these profound changes in their lifestyle? It was absolutely contradictory evidence. The second case study that intrigued me was the Delancey Street Foundation, which is a complex that if you didn't know it, you would think were very expensive condos on the waterfront, the Embarcadero in San Francisco, by the base of the Bay Bridge. It's actually a complex where 400 people who are generally ex-convicts, usually they've been arrested and incarcerated for multiple felonies. Usually they've had serious drug addictions, often heroin, alcohol, multiple drugs, since they were 12 or 13 years old. These are people who grew up usually in the 3rd generation of crime, drug addiction, and poverty. Their parents, their grandparents all came from the same background. In prison, they were typically diagnosed as being psychopaths or sociopaths, that 1% or so of the population who are thought to have no empathy, no feelings for other people, and that the psychology profession really admits that they don't know how to get these people to change and think it's impossible for them to change. Delancey Street takes 400 of these people and puts them together with only one person who isn't a former addicted criminal, Berkeley PhD in psychology and criminology, named Mimi Silbert, who's 63 years old. She's about 4'11" and 98 pounds. And she lives together with these 400 ex-convicts, and they run a number of incredibly successful, thriving businesses in San Francisco. They run the best house moving, apartment furniture moving business in San Francisco. I've used it 3 times to move my furniture in the years I lived there. The first time I used it, I called my mother and I told her that the ex-convicts were coming to move my furniture. My mother in New Jersey, you can kind of guess what her reaction was, and I had to assure her that these were the most honest, the most reliable people in a business that's notoriously sleazy and unreliable. The ex-convicts were the ones I trusted. The Delancey Street restaurant on the waterfront in San Francisco has thrived as a successful restaurant in one of the most competitive restaurant marketplaces in the world. They also run a bookstore cafe. They sell Christmas trees. So they've taken these people and not only gotten them to live sober, law-abiding lives, but have turned them into the kind of entrepreneurial, enterprising workers that any company would like to have. So that was the second example. And a number of people do drop out of Delancey Street, but a majority of the people who come in, having been in prison, wind up after 4 years or so emerging from the Delancey Street program and living productive lives in society. Absolutely incredible. Amazing transformation of people who were thought to be the most hopeless and the most impossible to change. Then I was like, okay, so we have people who are really ill, we have drug-addicted criminals. What about the really hard cases about change? What about change in corporations with workers? Because, anyone in the managerial class knows that, you can buy all the leadership books you want, but, what about change in the corporate world? And it just so happened that in the Bay Area, I was like, well, who are the workers who are, by reputation, the most kind of ornery, rebellious, kind of impossible to control, impossible to manage, the places that have had the most strife between labor and management, the workers who no one could control. And so you think of different industries, but I thought of the auto industry. And it turned out that in Fremont, California, near Oakland, there was a General Motors car factory that in the 1970s and early 1980s was considered the worst car factory in General Motors. General Motors quality back then wasn't quite as high as it is now, as you may recall. And this factory kind of struggled to produce cars with 40 or 45 defects per car. General Motors in the 1960s had kind of an interesting approach. They decided to measure the quality in their cars. So they had a 100-point scale, with 100 points being a perfect car. And they would kind of subtract 1 point for each defect or problem in the finished car. The only problem was that most of the cars struggled to get a 60 because they had 40 or more defects. And that wasn't acceptable because in elementary school, 60 was or high school, 60 was a failing grade. So GM in the 1960s changed this, so they made 145 the standard. So if you had 45 or fewer defects, you got 100 or more. And perfect, A+. And if you had only, if you got like 120 or 125, you had a celebration in your plant because the car only had 20 defects, and that was really worth celebrating. So this Fremont plant struggled to get a 100 score. But not only that, it had incredibly high absenteeism. On any given day, 1 out of every 5 workers wouldn't bother to show up for work. When they did come into work, they had to try not to get their car tires punctured by all the broken beer bottles in the parking lot. There was incredible hatred, animosity between workers and labor. The workers fought among themselves so much that the national leadership of the United Auto Workers had to sort of come in and take over the local chapter. It was just really an awful situation. The top General Motors executive said that these workers are unmanageable, and they decided to close down the plant rather than to try to continue producing cars there. They laid off thousands of workers, and the plant was idle for a while. And then Toyota came in and said, we want a foothold in the American market. Why don't we take over the plant? General Motors wanted to spy on Toyota's technology, so they agreed to a joint venture called NUMMI and went forward and let Toyota come and take over the plant. The United Auto Workers said, okay, but you have to rehire all of the workers who've been fired who were considered to be unmanageable. Toyota did that, and within a number of months, they were producing cars that had extremely few defects, and ultimately they reached no defects. And the auto magazines all said that these were the best cars that had ever been produced in America, with the workers who were considered unmanageable. So I had these 3 case studies, which provide the first 3 chapters of the book, and I was like, anecdotally, journalistically, I can go and get these examples of incredible, profound change that no one thought was possible. And so in the heart patient situation, it must be that not that people can't change, it's that the medical system, the healthcare system, doesn't know how to motivate people to change. And I went into kind of the vast literature about psychology and newer sciences like neuroscience and cognitive science, to try to understand this. And at first it was kind of easy because the people who run the healthcare system were following some very kind of simple myths about what motivates change, which are very commonly held by people in business and throughout society. I call them, again, since you have to sort of have everything that the people can memorize very easily, I call it the 3 Fs, for facts, fear, and force. The first is facts. The people who run American business, who run the healthcare system, certainly in the information technology field, you have engineers, you have MBAs, you have people who are very rational and generally have a faith that other people are rational, and then if you give people accurate information, if you give them the facts, that they will do the right thing. But then why, when doctors say, we have diagnosed you with severe heart disease, why doesn't that motivate people to change their behavior? You're giving them the accurate information. It couldn't be clearer. If you tell General Motors that your market share has been declining, and the facts are there. So what if people aren't rational? What if they're emotional? So why don't we appeal to the strongest emotion? That's fear. So why don't we try to scare the hell out of people? So in the case of the heart patients, you say, you have a very bad disease. It's going to kill you. You're going to die. You have to change. Again, that doesn't change people either. And in the book, I get into a lot of the reasons, and you can look at it from a cognitive science perspective, where people have conceptual frameworks and kind of reject facts that don't fit in. You can look at it from the standpoint of psychological self-defense, that people, in order to get through the day and to get through the week, need to protect themselves subconsciously from frightening or difficult facts, and so we don't think about them, we avoid thinking about them, we deny that we have the problem. The psychology is very well understood. So the facts don't work, fear doesn't work, and finally, as a last-ditch effort, we resort to force. We say, do this because I'm your doctor. Do this because I'm your boss. Do this because I'm your parent and you're a teenager. Enough said about force. Accomplished adult people need their self-respect as much as teenagers do. And when someone assumes this position of superiority to us, we tend to try to protect our self-esteem, even if they actually have a point about our problems and our struggles. So if the facts don't work, fear doesn't work, force doesn't work, and probably the biggest misconception of all is that crisis doesn't actually lead people to change. The heart patient example is the perfect example. Here are people are in this change or die crisis. It does not lead them to change. It's too frightening for them to think about their situation, and also they don't know how to change. If the strategies that they've used over the years, over the decades, haven't worked, and they simply don't know how to change. So I was thinking, well, there must be answers. I never studied psychology in my academic training, but psychology has been a science for a century, and a lot of very smart people have put tremendous effort in studying into this, and so I'll give myself a crash course in psychology and see if they've actually understood this. And to my pleasant surprise, the science of psychology has done wondrous things. They've come upon the secrets of how people change and how they don't change. The dean of the Johns Hopkins Medical School apparently doesn't know this, but they've done it. And even if you just look at Western psychotherapy, short for psychological therapy, which literally means mind changing. So if you look at the different approaches to psychotherapy in Western science, there are more than 400 distinct identifiable schools of psychotherapy that have evolved since Sigmund Freud and his couch. And they've been studied to death. And there's been tremendous amount of resources and brain power trying to figure out which of these 400 plus approaches is the best, which is the most successful, which is the winner. And the research by the 1970s and 80s came to the conclusion that all of these different approaches work somewhat more or less. None of them really work significantly better than others. And the reasons that they all work to some extent is because of what they have in common. not what sets them apart. So, if I'm the proponent of theory 365, I may think that my theory and strategies has the answer to motivating and changing human behavior, but actually it's the common denominators behind all these theories that makes them successful to the degree that they're successful. And this was first discovered actually in the 1950s at Johns Hopkins Medical School and Hospital by a professor of psychology named Jerome Frank. He didn't have the decades worth of research, but he tried a very simple experiment with the psychiatric patients and psychological patients at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He said, why don't we take 3 different groups and try radically different approaches with them and see which works best. Why don't we have one group that is a patient meeting one, and these are people suffering from stress, anxiety, kind of the usual causes of mental distress. Why don't we take one group and have them meet one-on-one with a therapist daily? Why don't we take another group and make it a group therapy session where a big group of patients are there talking together with a therapist moderating? And why don't we have another group that is kind of sporadic, where the patient meets with a doctor but only kind of once in a while, without that kind of intensive thing. And we'll do this as a simple study, and we'll get the patients to kind of rate their level of stress and anxiety and depression and all the symptoms in the beginning and the end. And we'll have the doctors rate them at the beginning and the end. And we'll have an independent third party of social workers do it. So they constructed this little experiment, and they wanted to see who was going to be the winner. And it turns out that all of them were pretty much the same, and they all helped somewhat, and they were all pretty much the same. And again, over the years and over the decades, a vast scientific literature would emerge from this. But from this very kind of simple, crude experiment, Jerome Frank realized that the reason these things worked was what they had in common. And that was forming a close emotional relationship with a person or with a community of peers that inspires a new sense of hope. That it was the human chemistry, the personal chemistry and relationship, which took these people who were demoralized, who had given up hope that they could change, and actually created the possibility that they would, and that they would do the hard work to go through the learning process of changing. Now, this might seem kind of squishy to those of us who come from scientific and technological backgrounds when you talk about hope, and you talk about kind of intangibles of human chemistry, but it actually has extraordinary explanatory power about how some people might go to a therapist and have enormous improvements, and others might have no improvement because the chemistry of the people or the chemistry of the group. And even more importantly, I think that this actually is extremely rational, because change is essentially a process of learning complex new things. It's learning hundreds of different new habits and skills and behaviors that ultimately inform new ways of feeling and thinking. And in order to invest the work and the struggle and effort that's involved in the difficult work of change, you're not going to do that. You're not going to do that investment of time and energy and ego unless you think there's a reasonable chance of success. It's a very rational kind of thing. So before you embark in a change effort, you want to know that the people you're working with, that you're going to be learning from and doing it with, that you have confidence in them, and that their method or their strategy, that you believe and expect that it's going to result in this positive change in your life. So you can't just tell people to change, which is what the heart doctors do with the heart patients. You can't just say, I'm your doctor, I'm in a position of authority, I'm telling you to change. You have to sell people on the change. You have to have a sincere conviction and communicate your sincere belief that they can change. The doctors in the medical situation, they don't believe that patients can change. They see thousands and thousands of patients over their career, and the patients don't do what they tell them. They don't take the medicines that are prescribed. The heart patients, 9 out of 10 of them, don't change their lifestyles. In the Dean Ornish example, the staff that's there working with the patients, they do have that sincere belief. The vegetarian chef believes that you're going to like eating the tofu that she makes. The personal fitness trainer believes that she's going to be able to get you off the couch and get you at least walking and maybe running at some point. The yoga and meditation instructor believes that you're going to be able to stretch. and they've worked with a lot of people before, and they've gotten them to stretch, and they've gotten them to exercise. And they're not just telling you to do something, they're actually there with you, spending lots of time with you, day after day, week after week, in a relationship. And anyone who's ever been in any kind of relationship knows that actually being there and spending the time together is important to have a relationship. So in the book, I talk about what I call the 3 keys to change. And the first I call relate, for this new emotional relationship that inspires hope. The second key, I'll do the keys really quickly to get to questions. The second key is what I call repeat. And this is the idea that any kind of real enduring learning comes through practicing, practicing, learning, and mastering a whole new set of skills and knowledge and habits. And again, the Delancey Street criminal example, I think, is my favorite example of this. Mimi Silbert, before she started trying to change the lives of criminals, she had a career training people to be police officers. She worked with about 50 police departments throughout the state of California. She had a PhD in criminology. And the way you take civilians like me and you make them into police officers is you don't just give them a badge and a gun and say, go out onto the streets and learn on the job. You do it through simulation. I mean, the same way you train pilots before you let them fly a plane. And you do lots of role playing and lots of simulation. And you have them in a safe setting again and again and again, repeating the proper behavior if you're a cop on the streets in a difficult situation, until they learn it, until it becomes second nature, until it really becomes embedded in their thinking, to the point that they can do it instantly without thinking. And it changes the way they think. They go from thinking with the mind of a civilian to thinking like a police officer. So when they're actually out there in the street, they are police officers. They've been changed. Mimi Silbert said, well, if I can take normal civilians and turn them into police officers, why can't I take criminals and through simulation and role-playing turn them into sober, law-abiding, middle-class, productive members of society? And that's exactly what she does in this complex in the waterfront. And she says, okay, you don't feel like a sober, middle-class person, but act as if you are. And we're going to teach you how to walk like a middle-class person, how to talk like a middle-class person, how to deal with other people without threats and violence. We're going to teach you hundreds of specific skills and habits, and you're going to repeat them again and again until they become second nature. And then when we finally do put you out in the greater society, you will have been transformed. And that leads me to the third and final key to change. We've had relate, repeat, and because they all have to have the same first letter. Relate, repeat, and reframe. And that's when you had the repeated behavior ultimately drives shifts in the deep-rooted patterns of how you think and feel as well as act. The more logical approach, the more intuitive approach is that we have certain beliefs. And because we have beliefs, then that influences our actions. And that's true. But the key to change that I talk about in the book is the reverse. It's that by repeating actions over and over, that is what ultimately drives changes in our beliefs. If you have been at Microsoft for a certain number of years, you will want to think that those years were well spent and that they were productive and that it was a good thing to do. So the act of kind of being at Microsoft will give you a strong incentive subconsciously to think that this was a good thing to do with that period of your life. From having, I'm sure it was, of course, people, through their actions. I mean, if you decide you want to be a runner, the first few days when you get up at 6 in the morning and put on the running shoes and go out in the dark to run, you don't feel like a runner. Your legs hurt, you're short of breath, you're only making it halfway around the reservoir rather than the full way that you intended to. You kind of feel like an idiot. But after you've actually gotten out there at 6 in the morning every day for months or for a year or 2 years, you've gotten better at running. And because you've actually done it, you feel like a runner in your gut. And you actually think like a runner. Because you are a runner. You've actually done it. Mimi Silbert likes to say that change is a verb. It's something you have to do. It's not just a matter of deciding to adopt a new belief. Beliefs are only driven by repeated experience over time. And it's kind of fascinating. I mean, it's like looking back at photos of yourself from an earlier decade and kind of being astonished that you wore that necktie or bell bottoms or something like that. We like to think that as people we're consistent, that we have something immutable about our character or about ourselves, but actually we do change. We have tremendous potential to change, and it's something that we really should recognize because it's a vital part of who we are. So that is a 60,000 word book in a half an hour nutshell, greatly condensed and probably confusing. But I'd love to do questions and discussion. Yes.
Yes. Psychology went through this. They arrived at that conclusion that it's what's common in the treatments.
Right.
Is psychology's cure rate any higher than any of the other medical disciplines? They went through that eureka moment. That's question one.
Right.
Question two, organizationally, I've seen a lot of profound change that wasn't driven by altruistic understanding. It was driven by forced realization, an event that was pivotal that firms had to change. So, two questions. One is, what's the track record on psychology if they went through that eureka moment?
Well, it's interesting because in the limited space of this talk, I know this is a very sophisticated scientific and technical audience, and I wanted to try to talk about the theoretical underpinnings of what I do of the book. The issue with psychology is I think that the practice of therapists has been severely limited by this model that we've inherited from Sigmund Freud and the invention of psychoanalysis, that Freud was coming from a medical doctor paradigm and took that same kind of model of changing people's minds coming from a doctor and a patient meeting together one-on-one in a private setting the way it happens in medicine. And I think that is helpful for psychological, for mind changing, but it's extremely limited. It's a very restrictive kind of approach, and I think that even though having a therapist, a teacher, a coach, a mentor, a guide of some kind is obviously very good in any kind of learning. I mean, if you wanted to learn French or Chinese or downhill skiing or how to play the guitar, having a really good teacher for one-on-one lessons obviously is much more valuable than just buying French for Dummies or the tapes. But the much more powerful way of changing people is the impact of the community and the culture, and this being part of a community. Because right,
my question is,
which is out of the box.
Did they practice what they preach? Did they take their
No,
academic and translate it into their clinical and improve their cure?
No, the psychology profession really hasn't taken advantage of these, of its own findings, because, even if there are 400 distinct schools of psychotherapy, someone's always going to come out with school 401, with their name on it, that's developed at their institution, and say that it's the best. And, people whose entire academic training and professional practice is wedded to the being proponents of School 426 aren't going to suddenly say, all this theory really doesn't matter. What really matters more is whether I have a good chemistry with the patients. And this is despite the fact that there have been all kinds of studies where they've taken not only trained psychotherapists, but they've taken people with less training or no training, and have often had very good effects in the same. There have been so many abundance of studies with that shows that it's not the specific strategy so much as the human relationship, and yet. Do you want to hang out a shingle saying I'm a PhD and I'm an expert in this kind of therapy, or do you want to just say I'm an empathic person? One of the people I worked with in this book, the woman who actually conducted my wedding ceremony, all of my relatives from New Jersey thought she was a rabbi, but actually she's a Buddhist, and she is a life coach, and she's really one of the most empathic people I know, someone who's incredibly caring, who is a great listener, who has tremendous patience, who has tremendous concern for other people, and through a practice over years without the kind of academic, I mean, you know, it's very California. I mean, she spends a lot of time going to this kind of alternative symposia and such, and she, you know, I think, has wonderful results with a lot of people. But you know, in San Francisco, you know, where you have a very alternative culture, people from that alternative culture might like the fact that she isn't a PhD and such. And in a lot of other cultures, they would. I mean, I've had friends who've talked about her, and dismissed her as being a quack, and because their conceptual framework is that credentialism and formal training has a direct correlation. But so I think human nature. It's we in the professional world. It's the credentials, training. People. It's in a very competitive marketplace. People want to distinguish their product rather than just saying that a lot of other competitors have good solution. And then the second part of your question is kind of the road to Damascus, the blinded on the road to Damascus moment. And that's kind of a great a great story. But I think most people don't. When I say in the book that change doesn't come from a realization, it comes from a long process of learning. And it's kind of like learning a foreign language or a musical instrument. And you might have a moment where you say, I need to learn Chinese. But you actually need to go and learn Chinese. And, because you might have been blinded on the road to Damascus or the road to Shanghai and realize that you need to learn Chinese. But actually learning it is going to involve being a beginner, getting a teacher, maybe going and living in China for a while. I think the thing is that we understand learning very well. We just don't think about change as learning. We think about change as having more willpower or working harder. And we don't acknowledge that the reason we fail at change is because the solutions, the strategies that we've repeated again and again don't work. And that we're speaking English and we need to speak Chinese. Yes.
So, Alan, could you give an illustration or an example of these principles being worked out in a corporate type of environment? And part of the reason, well, let me tell you why I asked that question, because in the course of a company's lifespan, there's at some point a need for it to reinvent itself, for it to continue to thrive, right? But that whole sense of community is its current culture. And that's the thing that made it successful in the first place and kind of binds everybody together. So how do you create that type of relational bond that gets people to move from where they are, as successful as they are, into this new state where the company has reinvented itself so that it continues to be a leader and thrive?
That's a great question. I think, this is one of the hardest issues that I wrestled with in the book, because corporate culture is remarkably persistent. There are few things more tenacious in the world than corporate culture. I talked to Jeff Bezos and some of the early executives at Amazon.com about this. In Amazon's early days in the mid-'90s, Bezos basically had this idea, which I agree with, that the first 50 or 60 people who come into a company basically create the culture and lay down the cultural DNA. And if the company does grow and succeed and expand greatly, it kind of replicates the cultural DNA from that original 50, 60, maybe at most 100 people. Because employee number 50, as the company is growing, winds up hiring new people and hiring people who reflect. The founders hire a group of people who reflect their values, beliefs, ideals, have similar backgrounds, trainings, reflect the culture they want for the company. And then those people hire people, and those people hire people, and they're all working together and influencing each other. And when new people come in from the outside, they have an extremely strong incentive to fit in culturally, because their careers and their livelihood and their respect and professional reputation depends on it. And if they really don't fit, they'll probably leave or get fired. Not in technology companies, which are much nicer employers, but in other more brutal traditional fields. So when Bezos was starting Amazon, he would personally interview every job candidate. And he told one of the early executives there that he would rather interview 100 or 200 people and not hire one than hire someone who wasn't right for the culture he was trying to create. And this totally, maddened all the other early executives at Amazon, because we're a startup, we're growing really quickly. We need warm bodies. Give us warm bodies. Put someone there. We're selling books. It's the internet. Stuff's coming in from around the world. And Bezos totally drove them nuts, but he really succeeded in creating, a culture that, that the culture that he wanted, even as the company grew. So you create this culture, and Microsoft, Gates really did exactly the same thing with Microsoft and any other company that's had a very strong culture. So now your question is, how do you change that culture when the company needs to change and needs to reinvent itself? And it's extremely hard. In fact, one of the reasons this Delancey Street program works for ex-convicts is Mimi Silbert has created an incredibly strong culture at Delancey Street and entrenched that culture. So when newcomers come in, the heroin-addicted criminals, they try very hard to fit in to the culture of the reformed addicted criminals. And she basically uses the power of a strong corporate culture to mold outsiders to change. So how do you change that culture? I give some examples in the book, and you have to do some kind of pilot where you actually can teach people an entirely different way of being, and then you can hold that pilot up as an example to influence peers. My favorite case of this was when Lou Gerstner came into IBM and was doing the IBM turnaround in the 1990s. He hired as his head of strategy Bruce Harold, who had been one of the co-founders of the Boston chicken rotisserie restaurants. If you knew IBM from those years, the executive hallways in IBM, they're kind of like as wide as this room, and they're very kind of quiet and august, and they have a very kind of elite view of themselves and their position in the world. And within the IBM entrenched culture that had been entrenched over decades, two things really determined the status of senior executives. How many billions of dollars of revenue your unit generated, and how many thousands of employees reported to you. And so Gerstner and Harold realized that they needed to create new businesses, and they needed to have a new entrepreneurial mindset, and that all of their talented senior people were basically minding the old businesses, and no one wanted to go and create entirely new businesses from scratch. And that was kind of one of the central problems in trying to reinvent IBM in a technology world that had changed radically. So what Bruce Harold did is he took one of those senior executives, Rod Atkins, who I think was running the Unix business or some really important business for IBM. And they said, you no longer have 10,000 employees. You have 0 employees. And we want you to go off in this office with 0 employees and start a new business from scratch. And Atkins, thinking from the old IBM frame of reference, thought that he had been fired, and this was kind of the face-saving way of giving him time to do a resume and call the headhunters. He was in his 40s. He had a stellar career at the company, and he didn't understand why he was being fired. And he actually said, "What am I going to tell my mother?" And they had to bring in Sam Palmisano, the CEO, to say, no, you haven't been fired. This is important. We really do want you to start a company from scratch with no employees and go do it. And the chicken guy is going to be your mentor and teacher, and you're going to meet with him every week. So Rod Atkins is there alone in the room, and every week he meets with the chicken guy. And the chicken guy says, okay, so what problems are you having now that you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a new business? And Atkins says, no problems. I don't have any problems. Because when you're a senior executive running a multi-billion-dollar business unit, it's all about being in control and being able to, to control a business and manage it. You're a manager. You're in control. And so Harold said, of course you have problems. Starting a new business is all about problems. That's what entrepreneurship is. And so they kind of went like this in a dance for weeks until ultimately Harold, from his entrepreneurial background, did mentor and teach Atkins, who started a new business that has become a multi-billion-dollar business that they started from scratch, that's been held up by the senior leadership of IBM as an example of exactly what they want in the company. And once he's had the success, then all of the other people who were at Atkins' level are saying, gee, the prestigious thing to do in the company now is not to have 10,000 employees. It's to go and have 0 employees and start a new business from scratch. And that's the cool thing. And sign me up. Get me to the chicken guy. When can I do this? By the way, Boston Chicken, all the financial scandals came after Bruce Harold went to IBM. It's the early growth was during his time there. And so they basically, Harold knew that he needed what John Cotter from Harvard Business School calls short-term wins. He needed to have a victory that he could produce relatively quickly, that would be clear, that would be visible, that would be undeniable, that would inspire hope among the IBM executives that as head of strategy, he and first Gerstner and then Palmisano were going to be able to change something. Then he needed a new relationship with Atkins where it was actually a teaching relationship, because you couldn't just tell people who had always been in a big hierarchical company, be scrappy entrepreneurs. You had to teach them, you had to mentor them, you had to take them through a difficult learning process. Then he used the awesome power of peer pressure to get the other senior executives to want to do the same thing by having done one high-profile example. And since then, a number of other people have gone and started these startup companies. I mean, has it entirely changed the culture of IBM? No. I mean, does IBM still have a lot of the issues that face any very large global hierarchical, deeply entrenched company? I mean, yes. But I think it's done significant things. And when you talk to Harold, he says, it's the same psychology that influences his children. I mean, they look to role models, and they respond to peer pressure. Just because we're in our 40s or 50s and 60s and, are very accomplished in our fields doesn't mean that the same psychology doesn't apply to us. Yes, in the back.
Did this Mr. Unit start?
I wish I remembered. I think it's in the book. I'd done a magazine article about it originally. I think it's like a $2 or $3 billion business now, which in the $90 billion scheme of things in IBM, you probably haven't heard of, but it's. I could find that out for you. I mean, the idea was still that if you start enough $1 billion, $3 billion new businesses and create a culture around that, eventually it starts to add up. So, yes.
So, your book is largely about radical shifts and sea changes, more or less. And I'm wondering whether you looked at incremental change and how that factors into the radical shifts, whether there is, whether you have, your heart patients, for instance, going through an incremental phase where they first improve their diet and then do exercise, or is it really better if you need to change to just do it all at once and get it out of the way?
The intuitive, logical answer is the incremental change should be easier for people. If every day for lunch you have a cheeseburger and fries, maybe you'll just start by having a hamburger and fries, and then maybe you'll go to the hamburger and the baked potato, and and then maybe you'll like the hamburger with only half of the bun and kind of things. It makes sense to us that incremental change should be easier. What the Dean Ornish program with heart patients has found, though, is that radical change, in that case, works better, and it's because of this short-term wins concept. Ornish, he basically figures anyone who's going to be on a diet is going to be kind of disgruntled because they're not eating what they want to eat, and they're going to be unhappy whether it's a big change or a little change. But if you make a big change, which in the Ornish program goes from people who had extremely unhealthy eating habits to suddenly getting no more than 5% of their calories from fat and eating a diet with no meat or animal products, except I think you get 8 ounces of non-fat yogurt is kind of the big indulgence there. I mean, this is a huge thing, and he's done this not only in San Francisco, which is in Sausalito, which is his home base, where people really like raw food and tofu and things, but he's done the program in Omaha, Nebraska, and South Carolina, where they told him that we consider gravy to be a beverage, and Mutual of Omaha actually funded one of his studies, and they did it in Omaha. And he's basically found that, okay, you put these people on the radical diet, and they're really going to dislike it. I mean, the first time he did it at a hotel in Houston. When he was in medical school, he got a bunch of heart patients together at a hotel in Houston and fed them this vegetarian diet, and they would sneak down to the lobby at midnight to have pizza at the bar. So they're not going to like it. But after 1 month, the heart patients in the Ornish program typically have a 91% reduction in the frequency of their chest pains. And after 1 month, they really tangibly feel much better. And they really feel the results, and they say, this is really a hard program, but we feel the benefits, and it's worth sticking with. Whereas if you make really, if you're just having the hamburger instead of the cheeseburger, after 1 month, maybe you'll be a ½ pound lighter, or you're not going to see any difference, and you're not going to feel any different. So what Ornish does is the rapid improvements are the strongest motivator for people to stick with a long-term and difficult change. Again, people want, they need hope. They want, you have to sell it to them, and you have to kind of prove, do kind of a proof of concept that it will work. And so I mean, like with this IBM example, you could say, okay, we're all going to be a little bit more entrepreneurial now, and and maybe people will believe you, but they probably won't. And it's, but instead of saying, okay, we're going to, make you an entrepreneur and show that you can be successful. I mean, it's really counterintuitive, but, right off the bat, you need to have that kind of short-term victory that, I mean, it's one of the key ways of selling the program and having the original hope and inspiration. Let me just get a little water here. Excuse me. Other questions in way in the back?
Have you speak to how companies or executives have made major changes, rapid changes. Have you had any examples where a frontline employee has actually proposed a rapid change, either in a corporation or in an organization, and actually taking that through to make a larger impact?
Sorry. Just give me 1 second here to. The only time I've really seen frontline employees having major impact is in organizations that already have that kind of very open entrepreneurial culture. So if you look at Richard Branson and the Virgin group of companies, the woman who did Branson's wife's nails at a little neighborhood salon in London, excuse me here, I've just totally lost my voice. She proposed to Branson's wife that they have manicurists and massage therapists on the Virgin Atlantic plains. And Branson's wife told him, and he liked the idea. And now this woman, instead of being a nail therapist at a neighborhood salon, she is the manager in charge of the literally hundreds of therapists who work on Virgin Atlantic's airlines, and runs a substantial business unit from having generated the idea. The flight attendant on one of Virgin's planes was engaged to get married and was very frustrated with how difficult it is for brides to go through the whole process of planning their wedding and getting their gown and such. So she took the idea to Branson, and she went from being a flight attendant to the top executive of one of his subsidiaries, Virgin Bride, which has a wedding superstore in Trafalgar Square in London. So, I mean, Branson has that kind of culture where, I mean, unfortunately in Branson's case, it kind of helps if you're an attractive young woman to get his attention. but still, it's something. And he has had these people who weren't even in managerial positions, who were kind of just frontline workers, who have proposed business ideas. But it kind of helps that Virgin has something more than 300 different businesses going at a time, and Branson, is really willing, when he has people he likes and has confidence in, when they have good ideas, he's really willing to give them a chance. And he likes the name as well. Virgin Bride was kind of a great name. The other example is again to kind of look at the issues of a company with a kind of big global hierarchical culture. It's very hard to convince the frontline people to believe in a change effort, even when you're sincere and you're giving it all the support that it needs. At IBM, one of the biggest complaints was, I think IBM has something like 10,000, 15,000 frontline managers. And their biggest complaint was that they couldn't really do anything without getting all kinds of approval. So if they needed to take quick action, they needed to get all these different approvals, and there was all this formality and bureaucracy and procedures and forms and such. So Sam Palmisano said, why don't we create a budget so every frontline manager can spend up to $10,000, no questions asked. If you need it for your business, if you need to help a customer, just go ahead and do it, spend the money. You don't have to ask anyone's approval. Just put it on your credit card, we'll have a fund there. And the only thing that they asked is afterwards, send an email with the anecdote about what happened. It's you needed to help a customer, so you rented a helicopter and went to their site off in the wilderness somewhere. And so we can share the anecdotes around the company. So Palmisano told this to one of his executives and said, go do what's necessary, make it happen. I want to do an announcement of this immediately. So the executive went to the finance people and said, okay, we need to set aside this money. And the finance people said, that's fine, but, you're going to need all these approvals and this process, and, here's, we'll set up. And he's like, no, that's not the point. And the finance people said, well, you can't do this. This is, 15,000 managers times $10,000. That's what, $150 million. It's $150 million. You can't just have $150 million without any control. Even in a $90 billion company, that's still, more than a rounding error. But Palmisano said, no, this is a $150 million bet on trust, and we're going to set up this fund and let people spend it. Well, so he was actually backing up with money what he was saying. So in the first year, something like $100,000 of that $150 million actually got spent, because even though he was sincere, even though the structures were supporting the change, people still didn't believe it. It just didn't make sense to them. It contradicted everything they had ever experienced in their career at IBM or at other large companies. They were still afraid that if they chartered the helicopter, they were going to be fired. And I think in that kind of situation, you need for the guy in the next office to charter the helicopter, and you need to see that he doesn't get fired and actually he gets promoted, or the company puts something on the website saying, isn't this great, he chartered a helicopter, why haven't you chartered a helicopter lately? And then people begin to see that it's real, and and it influences their behavior. But so again, you can't just kind of tell people. They have to experience it again and again before it changes the way they feel and it changes the way they think. And that's the whole second key to change I talk about. That's it's repeat. Experiential learning isn't just for our kids in alternative schools. It's how our brains work as well. So yes, there.
What are the biggest inhibitors of change? So we're talking about motivators or techniques to change effectively. It's relate, reframe, and repeat. Which are the common set of inhibitors that change?
I think the biggest inhibitors to change is success, either for an individual or for a corporation. If you talk to neuroscientists such as Mike Merzenich at UCSF. Being successful in the mind of a neuroscientist is being a specialist, being an expert, someone who has mastery at something. So all of us have mastery at speaking English. which was kind of, kind of a hard thing to learn. But, once you learn English or whatever your native language is, you're a specialist, you're an expert in it. And we like this feeling of mastery and competence, and so the idea of learning another language where we're going to be a beginner, we're going to struggle, it's going to be frustrating. If we do it in public, it's going to be embarrassing and humiliating. It becomes much harder once we're already an expert or a specialist in something. And the same is true if you're a journalist or a software developer, or not just in your profession, but in the countless number of skills and habits of your daily life. So, if you live in New York City, you have all kinds. If you've lived in New York City successfully over time, which I did for 5 years, you develop all kinds of specialized skills that enable you to thrive in New York City. You know how to take the subway. You know how to hail a taxi. You know how to deal with the line at Fairway. These are not trivial things, and people coming to New York for the first time, can be very intimidated and such. But veteran New Yorkers get very good at this, and and they get a New York mindset. So when you hire someone from New York to come to Redmond, they're like, how come there isn't a 24-hour grocery at the corner? It's how do people live without a 24-hour grocery? It's it's a shock and it's an adjustment, but they're smart people and they can learn all the countless skills and habits. So that's kind of like the cognitive science background. But then for a person or for a company, once we're successful at something, we want to continue enjoying that competence and mastery, and rather than go through the learning process. And most people think that we continue learning throughout our careers, but actually we're just kind of keeping up with our specialty rather than learning something that's truly new and different and is actually keeping up our brain fitness and keeping active our ability to change, so it becomes a lifelong ability. If you're a software engineer, if you kind of keep up with the latest developments in software engineering, it's going to help you succeed in the profession that you already have great competence and success in. Kind of true learning in that situation is learning something that's completely different. It might be learning to write a novel, or it might be learning how to do ballroom dancing, or something that uses different intelligence and that you're just going to be embarrassingly bad at. But we're like, I keep up with developments in journalism. I feel like I'm learning, but it's not the kind of learning that is tied into real necessary for real change, and necessary for the kind of brain fitness that keeps up our machinery for learning and change into our senior years. So. I think, again, it's kind of paradoxical, but the more successful a person is, the people who really are the great New Yorkers, it's hard to imagine them living anywhere else because they're kind of optimized for New York. And the people who are the great, as a print journalist doing magazine articles and books, I don't want to have to learn how to blog. The 18-year-olds are better at blogging than I am, damn it. I want to keep doing what I'm better at and what all my training and background is in. And if you're General Motors, which, not that long ago in the scheme of things had 60% of the American auto market, you don't want to change. It's like you want to enjoy being dominant. So, I think, success is by far the biggest inhibitor to change.
Reframe work against success. How do they work against the inhibition that success?
Well, I think that you have to be open to learning with disregard for status, position. You basically, when I talk about the first key to change being having a new relationship with a person or community, it basically means that even though you are credentialed, successful, admired, recognized, you have to learn from other people who have different skills, who often will not have the same credentials, the same position as you do. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about Daniel Boulud, the famous French chef from New York, and how he kind of exemplifies this kind of creativity and learning. He came out of the classical French cooking tradition, which is very rigid. It takes years to learn and master through apprenticeship and work. And in the traditional classic French cuisine, there's a proper way to do everything. There's a proper way to cut an onion up. There's a proper way to do a sauce. It's an incredibly accomplished field, but it has a very kind of rigid set of rules that you learn and master and over time and kind of seem like the right way to do things. But Boulud, when he went from France to New York, which is an extremely competitive and creative restaurant market, had all this kind of peer competition from other chefs who were combining French with other cuisines and doing fusion cuisine and such. And that influenced him. But more importantly, he was influenced by the people who work for him. And here he was, one of the most famous chefs in New York in the world, and he has these immigrants from all kinds of different countries working in lowly, subservient jobs in his kitchen. And he becomes fascinated with the skills and techniques that they have that are totally foreign to his own classical French training. And for example, he had one worker in his kitchen who came from Japan who never actually touched food with his hands. Everything he did was with chopsticks. He held it with chopsticks, whether it was like an enormous lobster tail or just like 2 little slivers of herbs. He would hold it with chopsticks, and he would be able to cut with a speed and precision that Boulud had never seen anyone else do. And not only could he do this with speed and precision, but he could do it blindfolded. And Boulud, if he had stuck to his training, if he had stuck to the whole ideology that had made him successful, that had made him one of the most recognized chefs in the world, he would say, that is not how you do things. Get those damn chopsticks out of my kitchen. But instead he was like, this is great. This is fascinating. I can learn from him. I can learn from all the other people working in my kitchen who come from different culinary traditions, who have knowledge, who have insight that I don't have. But my favorite example of the right mentality for change is Boulud in his memoir. He talks about walking through the streets of Greenwich Village past a very kind of humble, inexpensive pizza place. This is not the kind of places that put arugula on the pizza. It's more like extra cheese or pepperoni, the $1.50 a slice. There are literally thousands of these things in New York, and they're all called, Famous Ray's, Original Ray's, something like that. And there was a guy in the window making the pizza dough, throwing the pizza dough in the air and stretching it out and throwing it in the air. And Boulud stopped in front of the window, and he looked at it, and he was like, that's great. I love it. That's perfect. I want to be able to do that. With total disregard to the fact that, at Boulud's restaurants, everything costs $60 a plate, and this guy's making a $1.50 pizza, and Boulud has 4 stars from the New York Times, and this guy, is never going to be reviewed, and Boulud's making millions of dollars, and this guy's making minimum wage, and everyone knows Boulud's name, and there are, thousands of anonymous people in cheap pizzerias all around the 5 boroughs of New York throwing up the pizza. But, Boulud has that interest in learning and acquiring skills and acquiring understanding that's outside of the tradition that he works so hard to master and that has made him famous. And he's like, I want to know how to do that. So in my book, I do a little thought experiment saying, well, what if Daniel Boulud did actually learn how to make pizza dough? How would he do it? Where would he learn? Who would teach him? If he was doing it in the kitchen of his 4-star restaurant on the Upper East Side, and he threw the pizza dough in the air and it fell down on the floor, everyone he works with would laugh at him, and he'd be humiliated and embarrassed. And here this famous chef can't, do this. And, is he going to hire the minimum wage guy to teach him? Are they going to do it in secrecy, in private? So, he recognizes, Boulud recognizes it would probably take him a year of work to be able to master stretching the pizza dough and throw it in the air. And it's something he desperately wants to do. But where is he going to have the opportunity to do it? And is he going to take 6 months off from running his restaurant empire to learn how to, make $1.50 pizza? So, all the implications of his success make it almost impossible for him to fulfill his aspiration to learn something new that fascinates him. And only after he actually learned to make the pizza dough and throw it in the air himself would he have a deep understanding of it, and would he be able to then innovate and expand on it and turn it into something he could put in one of his fancy restaurants and get the New York Times to rave about. So, again, the kind of, the work and embarrassment and effort and struggle that goes into mastery, which then goes into kind of true innovation. I would love to do a whole other book on applying these ideas to the creative mindset. But, I think it basically having kind of a disregard for even though you're successful, having a disregard for everything that comes with that success, I think is really the key to changing for people. Yes? Do we have time for one more? Okay.
You talked about short-term wins. How important is it, do you think, to set really clear goals and to measure change so you get that feedback?
Well, again, coming from an engineering, MBA, kind of, rationalistic perspective, we want to engineer things. And we want to try to engineer human behavior. So we want to try to project manage it and set goals and measure things, and do it in the way that we would try to manage the physical universe, or try to manage fields that that are kind of stable and we understand how it works. And you really can't do that, because people going into a change effort, usually they don't really understand what's happening to them. Again, this is kind of why the influence of other people is important. The criminals coming into Delancey Street, Mimi Silbert has a very good psychological understanding of what goes on at Delancey Street. But the criminals going in, they don't understand. And you can't tell them, okay, this week you're going to master, dressing like a middle-class person, and we're going to judge you and evaluate you. And then next week, they come in and they're befuddled, and the world they're in doesn't make sense to them. Mimi Silbert calls it, the metaphor she uses for criminals coming into Delancey Street is immigration, because it's as if they were Mimi Silbert's own grandparents, who had been Eastern European Jews who spoke Yiddish, who came to New York and were there in a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, know the customs, have the skills necessary for success. And so, if people are in this foreign environment where they need tremendous amounts of learning, you can't kind of say, okay, you're going to learn this week and this next week. It's kind of like if you have an infant, they're going to learn at different rates, and there are going to be constant surprises. And you can think that, okay, by 18 months my child should do this, and maybe they will, and maybe it'll take longer, and maybe there'll be difficulties and such. It's a process of, there's not that kind of predictability in such a complex learning process. And and it's kind of befuddling to the person who's going through the change, because Rod Atkins, when he was running the Unix division at a big division at IBM that had been around for a long time, it's predictable. When he's learning to become an entrepreneur, he might take to it quickly. It might take longer. It's just kind of a messier. It's kind of a messier thing. To manage in that way, and that's why it's so clear to have the peer influence and the influence of teachers and the influence of peers, and to engage in relationship to kind of work in a customized, way with the the pace and the struggle. Just as you would in any kind of learning.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
If you'd like to read Change or Die, which I have read, it's fascinating. Thank you very much. And also, if you have other questions, he'll be here for a bit longer.